Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Donna Honarpisha, Assistant Curator of the Night Art and Research Center at ICA Miami, and I'm very excited to welcome you all to our special lecture today as part of our spring program on transoceanic relations, which has also had 3 seminars this past week with artist Christopher Cozier. This event, along with our pedagogical programming, our digital initiatives, are made possible with the support of the Knight Foundation. So I'm very thrilled to welcome our speaker, Christopher Cozier, who is an artist who lives and works in Trinidad. He is the co-director of Alice Yard, a collective which will be participating in Documenta 15. He was awarded a Pollock Krasner Foundation grant in 2004 and is a 2013 Prince Claus Award laureate. Through his notebook drawings to installations derived from recorded stage actions, Kozier investigates how Caribbean historical and current experiences can inform our understandings of the wider contemporary world. His exhibitions include the 5th and 7th Havana Biennials, Infinite Island, the Brooklyn Museum, Afro-Modern Journeys Through the Black Atlantic, Tate Liverpool, Entanglements at the Broad Museum, Michigan 2015. Relational Undercurrents at MOLA, LA, and the Sea is History, Historisk Museum, Oslo. He's also participated in public programs of the 10th Berlin Biennial. He's exhibited at the 14th Sharjah Biennial, the 11th Liverpool Biennial in 2021, Industrial Art Biennial, Croatia, and currently in Beyond the Sea Sings at the Times Art Center in Berlin, as well as Fragments of Epic Memory at the Art Gallery of Ontario, and Experiences of Oil at the Stavanger Museum in Norway. So please welcome me in welcoming Chris, and we're so delighted to have you and to extend our conversation from the last 3 days. We'll have a talk first, and then we'll end with a Q&A. So please just hold on to your questions until the end, and I will let you take it away.
Thank you, Donna. Thank you for Maria for the technical backup. And I want to thank the people that kind of sat through my meanderings over the last couple of days, because I felt we were all very much afloat. Just to sum up the direction of the conversation based on I've been sort of thinking a lot about suspended form, and in our conversations, I spoke about suspended form both metaphorically and in terms of the physicality, about how the things we make and the things we imagine, where they reside. In contention with the spaces, with the white box, the kind of the kind of conventional spaces that things happen, and the kind of spaces we occupy in places like the Caribbean. In my own sort of practice, I've also started to think a lot about the spurious nature of the spurious demand on wall labels, and in terms of how institutions define places like the Caribbean. I've become very, very interested in something in my mind I call the geography of production, because in the talks over the last couple of days, and it's becoming an issue in my own practice as well, as Caribbean artists or artists coming from places like the Caribbean, artists find, work could be imagined in one place, produced in another, and presented in even another. So there's a kind of way that's sort of central to the sort of way that we have to function, the way we imagine in spaces like the Caribbean. There's a kind of weird dichotomy or argument with a kind of requirement for us to be from a particular place. And when I talk about the geography of production, I think about the Caribbean as a space conjured by a particular kind of critique or conversation. And I used examples of works like by artists like Heino Smith and others that I have been in dialogue with over the years in those talks. I also thought a little bit about materiality in the sense that, we are places where materials are dumped, both extracted and dumped, and how artists working in these environments sort of shuffle that. When you think of artists like Hugh Locke or Ebony Patterson, a lot of what they produce is sort of like the detritus. It's produced with a kind of detritus of dime store kind of materiality that you find in haberdasheries and different kind of spaces, made in China, made in India. You never know where the materials come from. And then these materials, which tend to be at sometimes low-end consumer trivia, is kind of refashioned into kind of artworks that we pay money for, or through their reassembling or refashioning or through the presentation methodologies, they kind of take on another value. Also in our conversations, we meandered to conversations about dislodging the carnival, ideas of carnival, and from the anthropological, and try to deal with them in terms of where they really sit, in terms of urban contemporary spaces, from the 19th century to now in the Caribbean space, whether they evolve from riots or religious celebratory ritual practices. And I think also models for new ideas about art, its relationship to the public. In my own writing in the past, I talked about the agency of objects and actions in the social space. And I think in spaces like the Caribbean, performativity is not something that occurs late in the evolution of the practice of the visual, like how the cabaret Voltaire enters into the kind of canon of modern or contemporary conversations. In fact, I think there's a fallacy in the Caribbean to sort of build a historiography starting from topography, topographical forms of representation, or even painting. Our conversations talked a lot about, when I talked about suspended and itinerancy, obviously that issues of solidity and non-solidity came up. And in that context, I think the notion of the ocean as a fluid space is often in contention with how we define ourselves in terms of land spaces. And there's a speculation, even though land has its own kind of, another kind of fluidity, whether it is in geological time or in the bizarre constructions of historical time, where we talk about sieges and territorial, tragically, as we see now in places like Ukraine, or, but in a sense, the ocean is an open, fluid space. And what is the implications about that in terms of how we perceived the sort of nation state formation places like the Caribbean, and the concept of the Caribbean being defined as a place more so than a space. I come from the school to think of the Caribbean as a space that is conjured by a kind of critique that comes from a certain historical experience. So land falls in some ways, even though I'm not subscribing necessarily to the thought too fully, but I think the kind of notion of land and ocean as fluid, land has a different fluidity, of course, but I think just in terms of our own experience, land is linked to territory, and the ocean is, of course, a space where brown and black bodies move historically and even now, whether whether as refugees or escapees, or whether just a kind of inherent process of itinerancy and dodging, since places like the Caribbean were part of the sort of engine of modernity and capitalism, where people had to go through these journeys, arriving as property, becoming subjects of crowns, evolving into citizens of potential republics. So there's a kind of way in which, when these narratives are tied to land spaces as opposed to oceans, and yet we know Caribbean people continue to be on the move. So the notion of hovering, of being suspended, and the notion of itinerancy, the geography of production, has kind of, I'm trying to work this out. I don't have any kind of, I'm not sort of mandating this as a way, but I think it's a way that needs to be considered in terms of how we imagine what constitutes Caribbean practice, and how we imagine not just the practice of making things, but also the curatorial enterprise of trying to understand it, and narrating it. So it has all kinds of implications, and writers like Claire Tankons and people like that I've interacted with over the years have problematized this, processions, whether celebratory or ritual or resistance-based, sort of open questions, and the forms of production that revolve around that. I mean, to some degree, just to call oneself an artist in a certain way in places like the Caribbean is a kind of counter logic at first to the sort of colonial enterprise, because and then now to the kind of nation state formation enterprise. So the irony, it's very ironic and very complex. So with that said, that's the conversation we've been engaging in over the last couple of years, with couple of days, sorry, with different readings. And what I thought I would do is share a couple of projects of mine over the last couple of years in which I try to make sense of these concepts. I'll rush through some things and then I'll settle, because I wanted to kind of sit with two or three things that I'm processing at the moment. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try to share my screen, and then I'll speak while going through those images. So just confirm, is everybody seeing this? This is what we're seeing on the image?
Yes, I see it.
Okay. This is a very early work of mine when I returned to the Caribbean in the late 80s, early 90s, and it was called Wait, Dorothy, Wait. And what it did is I was working with postcards of the Caribbean space and splicing together postcards with descriptions of murders from the daily newspapers in Trinidad, in a kind of time in Trinidad's history where we would have 3 or 4 murders a year. Now we have 3 or 4 or even more murders a day. And I kind of juxtapositioned the typical tropical postcard type imagery with a kind of a calculated, almost indifferent description of a murder in the daily newspapers. And the framing inferred a kind of exalted idea of what constitutes art, rooted in kind of gold European, gaudy European frames, and a kind of notion that Impressionism and landscape painting was art and culture. And so this was a kind of work in which I was critiquing a certain kind of local value system. The title is based on a popular calypso written by a calypsonian called Black Stalin in that era, and in the 80s, in which basically, we were going through a recession and increase in violence and challenges. And so Dorothy is a character that exists since the 30s or 40s in Calypso. So he was kind of, the song was called Wait, Dorothy, Wait, because Dorothy wants to go and party. And he's saying, oh God, I can't party because of all of this chaos that's going on in the society. I want to party, but I can't party. So it's a kind of ironic song because it's a party song. I did these works at the time, talking about class difference. And so this is a pair of glasses made with wrought iron frames, the kind of burglar bars that we see in popular architecture. And it really talked about ways of seeing the world and whether you are inside or outside, a certain kind of class position in relation to the tropical landscape and the life we were living. I wouldn't spend too much time with this work, but at that time, I was beginning to think more about making some of these works I produced with craftsmen. The first work with a framer, the second work with a jeweler. So I would design these things rather than make them myself. And these were sort of conceptual objects that I was kind of placing in the cultural space. I soon lost interest in making objects. And so by a later point, I started doing these performative gestures. There were many, but this one I seemed to capture people's fancy at the time. Coming from the US art school, at that time I was thinking about artists like Boyce, David Hammers, and Vito Acconci and so on. So I decided to have a conversation with a shirt about art and different things like that. And this shirt is actually kind of a guayabera that made with like suit material that politicians of the time would wear. And it kind of hovers between the kind of blazer of Prince Philip and the military sort of camouflage jacket of Che, so or Fidel. So the question was to the political class, you can't have your cake and eat it. You have to make a decision. And I did these performances in one of the spaces around Port of Spain in the early 90s, kind of having these conversations with this shirt like it was a person, and the shirt being sort of like, concepts of authority, pedagogy, masculinity, and so on. What I had not expected when I did these works was that members of the audience would join in, tap me on my shoulder, and ask to speak to the shirt also, which spoke to me about the kind of interest in performativity in our societies and the kind of need to process or, whether to arrive at catharsis, to kind of, there were certain traumas that we were all dealing with. This evolved into a series of video collaborations with colleagues, kind of performance works. The first of which was something called Blue Soap, a kind of performance work in which I work with friends and colleagues doing these performances in the public domain, but filming them and then editing them into sort of multi-channel video works. At the time, I was thinking a lot about, performativity, but something else was starting that I'll talk about later on down in my presentation, which is the fact that at that time, which is in the mid-90s, there was a kind of an interest in participating in international projects, but I wasn't in that economy. I couldn't afford to build objects. So there was about a kind of footprint problem. I mean, at that time, it wasn't so much about, I hadn't thought so much about the predicament of the planet and the Anthropocene. At that time, it was just about the fact that I don't have a gallery. I'm not connected to the art world. And how do I participate in an event like the Havana Biennial if I don't have any kind of support to ship works and, and things like that. So I kind of gravitated towards performativity and video documentation of performance. So the first kind of moments when I showed internationally or outside of the Caribbean, having returned from art school, I gravitated to sort of doing video, because video even though it was in the early stage of video before the internet, and in fact, it was kind of more analog video and very clumsy, and it would take 6 minutes, 6 months to develop something with editing and all that kind of thing. At least the work could occupy space and convey ideas and create encounters outside of the budgets of shipping, insurance, and things like that. So that was a challenge at the time. So it dealt with like wall graphics. This is a piece called Icarus that was part of that whole installation that showed up in other locations afterwards. So this was a multi-channel video, things timed to go at so you can imagine in the early 90s how cumbersome this was before computer technology and so on would make it easy. So to do this piece, I had to have like 2-hour videotapes, like 8 machines. So another problem about economy came up that made me kind of run from it. And then I kind of started to think about maybe I don't want to do this, to spend so much time negotiating with video producers, cameramen, editing, because I found myself in another kind of rabbit hole. But throughout the process, I was always drawing. And I started to develop an interest in how central drawing was to my practice, in the sense that, if it's just me, a pencil, and a piece of paper, then, I don't have to do all these negotiations. So even though I was investigating live performance and investigating video and technology that was coming, digital technology, I found myself retreating to the kind of traditional training that I started with in art school, where it's just me, pencil, paper, and an idea. I didn't realize where it would eventually lead me. So these drawings were manifested themselves. The drawings happened on 2 scales, notebook size, like almost in a diaristic way. And then when something drove me, I would blow it up to a larger size. And but the drawings were not precious. They were done on available materials. And every time they were shown, they seemed to be dying. And something about drawing and ephemerality and the fleeting nature of thought started to enter into my practice, whereby some of these drawings, just to take them out of a roll and send them somewhere to be shown, their fragility became a question, and they became, so the moment in which they were showed or conveyed kind of contributed to their death, like a thought or an idea, or almost like kind of like currency, like how dollar bills get old and worn, but through exchange. So these works, their delicacy and their fragility became also part of their relationship to the ephemerality of thoughts and speculation. Because of course, coming out of conventional art school, I was trained in some way to imagine art in a kind of masculine, very aggressive, Eurocentric, of making things for eternity, for posterity, considered materials and stuff. And I said, no, I'm not dealing with that. I'm kind of withdrawing to the moment of getting the thought done. And once the thought was down, then it could have a life akin to the moment in which the thought, came about. So these are different drawings coming from that series. Most of them are life-size. These figures are life-size. This one had a funny title. It's called Intellectual Worker Incarcerated. And it talked about 3 kind of roles for the masculine subject, within the kind of construction of nation and so on. So I kind of went through these speculations in that era. Some of the works were digital, so I could send them to shows. This Icarus character showed up in many different exhibitions. This is a version of it where I just sent the digital file. By this time, as the late 90s evolved, you could email images and then they could be blown up. So Icarus was this weird officer gentleman-like character. It's strangely, it's a strange character because at the time, he had I used the face of Cedras, one of the guys that kind of were thumping their chest in Haiti in the 80s. And then I used a Russian officer in a Russian uniform, and his hands are kind of up in alarm and down in despair. And that was my kind of idea of Icarus. It's very strange, even though this piece alludes to sort of events of the late 80s, early 90s. I mean, they seem to return to the current moment. I did a number of works, with colleagues in other islands. This is an installation I did in Barbados, in which I talked about sort of who's in and who's out from, in the kind of constructions of nation. Because even though the Caribbean has a long history of colonial enterprises, expeditions and rampage, in the nascent moments of nationalism, say from the 60s to now, constitutionally, there still remain laws about assembly, laws that are discriminatory against, gender and sexuality and things like that. So I kind of tried to come up with these works that talked about the kind of pedagogy of nation, who's excluded and who's not, who's in and who's out. A lot of these works have kind of pulled out of circulation because I think we live in a time in which maybe irony is at risk. Or so some of these pieces, when they were shown, strangely enough, I had to kind of be really careful about how they were taken up and how they were understood by people on either side of the sort of discursive, the binaries, In fact, I've kind of pulled a lot of these pieces out of circulation, and I'm very nervous about showing them, even though they had a kind of particular agency at that time. Frustration with the Caribbean setting, and I found myself in places like Johannesburg doing residencies towards the end of the 90s, early 2000s, and different bodies of work came up. I got deeper into drawing at this time. And this was a series of drawings that I did that talked about, like how you have original sin in the kind of construction of Catholicism. So these works in South Africa in the late 90s talked about the original injury, the notion of sort of the kind of marketability of abjection. So in other words, the crutches, when you wear crutches, you kind of look as if you were in some way injured, but you could, like another Black man was shot yesterday somewhere in the US. But when you stand, and look like you don't need anything, then suddenly you become a dangerous presence. So the idea for the whole project was original injury kind of alluded to the construction of original sin in conventional Catholicism, where, you become meaningful when you are kind of hopping around or jumping around, but when you stand your ground or look as if you are able to get by on your own volition, you become a threat. And that to me seemed to have a meaning, producing work in South Africa, 4 or 5 years after in the late 90s, when South Africa had just become an independent nation state, coming out of the kind of horror of apartheid and colonialism and so on. Other works from the series. So it turned into a whole series of large-scale drawings. Around the same time, I was investigating music as well. I grew up in the Caribbean, in a culture of soca and dancehall, and in my era, before dancehall became so established, there was, in the context of Trinidad, there was something called the Blockorama, where a lot of the DJs that eventually moved to New York, that was part of the foundation of what started hip hop and all that kind of thing in Brooklyn and in the Bronx and wherever. In Trinidad in the 70s, there was a DJ culture, which I grew up in. And I became fascinated by the big sound systems and the way that these sound systems created both a physical and an ideological space, and I tried to map it out conceptually. So the idea of the arena kind of was derived from that configuration. And I started messing around with song and working with sound and DJs. This was work that was produced in the early 2000s. And then I kind of tried to work out imagery that was related. So it had a lot of weird, ironic things. Like here's two women that I cut out from a dancehall, Jamaican dancehall magazine. And then I put an AK-47 in the middle. And it's kind of like discussing the kind of bizarre gender biases of the musical form, you know, because of course the man in the middle and the two dancing girls on the side, you know, it's like all these reggae singers with female choruses or soca singers with female choruses, you know, the hard man and the gun and the kind of whole notion of, you know, masculine power and weapons and things like that. So this work didn't really receive much traction. I think it showed in a show in the Netherlands. So I actually produced a sound installation that one could experience in actual space. And then I produced a CD with different DJs and sound that people could use, walk away from the space and enter into the kind of arena of the music. After that, I kind of played around with different sort of colonial things. You know, I found these are old engravings that I saw in history books growing up, you know, the runaway slave poster that many people have used, like Hank Willis, myself, and others. And then, of course, the owner of land, right? The man that owns land, you know, the kind of landed gentry. And then I came up with my own character, which is the runaway guy with the briefcase. You know, I don't know if he's heading to Switzerland or Panama or Costa Rica or wherever. And I did these installations with these flags made out of paper and wooden stands. So all the men with the briefcases are running in one direction, and all the kind of runaway slaves are running or spreading out. And it talked about, this piece was called Cross Currents Refreshment. It looks like a regatta, it looks like the ocean, you know, flags. But one of the backstories of my life is that my parents were civil servants. So when I was growing up, my first studio was waiting around in their offices. So I developed an obsession with flags on desks and rubber stamps and office equipment. And I never realized the degree to which the kind of arsenal of bureaucracy entered into my consciousness. But instead of becoming a respectable civil servant like my parent, I became an artist. So I use the arsenal of bureaucracy to kind of do critical reflection and, you know, and to develop a practice. But what's interesting, sorry, about a lot of these works is that they can fit in a shoebox. And this is just made of paper, rubber stamped paper, little blocks of wood and kebab sticks. And, you know, so I can send it in a shoebox, but it can, coming out of the kind of experience as a child of building carnival costumes and being around, it occupies space in a very dramatic way with very limited and modest materials. So these are different works, you know, around that kind of concept. Another project of mine that's came up in that process was just further speculations about nation state and who's in and out. And this was a piece about wrapping sandwiches. You know, I grew up in the Caribbean in a certain period of time. My parents were sort of Creole middle class people that worked for the government. And as a child growing up in the school system, I realized that people had different ethnic foods. You know, people came from Chinese or Indian backgrounds or from more traditional sort of Black working class backgrounds. They had different kinds of food. I suddenly realized that the food that I had was kind of food from the supermarket. You know, I had Wonder Bread with cheese paste and cucumber and stuff, you know, and it was in a Star Trek lunch kit. And, you know, so I started thinking about the pedagogy of the kind of modern class, you know, so, and but I kind of wanted to have that messy other food that didn't package so well. And I discovered all kinds of things about Wonder Bread, being invented in Britain in the war, and then like some guy in Iowa designed the machine to cut the bread. And then also just like the name, like I discovered talking to colleagues from India that there were brands of bread in India that manifest itself as independence as well, that were called modern bread or Britannia or whatever, to talk about sort of like the modern housewife, but this kind of convenience. It looks like a North Korean military parade or like, or a Canadian housing scheme. So it was starting to talk about the streamlining of identity. And so this was a kind of an experiment, and it was a way of working collaboratively with other artists. So this project was done a video collaboration. I returned to video at this point with Richard Fang in Toronto. So this is a photo of the Canadian version of this work, which was done, curated by Andrea Fortuna and done with a video collaboration with Richard Fang. This piece disappeared, and then suddenly a request came to do it in a show about islands and so on in Berlin many years later, as far down as 2013. This is one of the things that accompanied this work, apart from the video, was a recording of an activist in the 60s that was trying to train children about the perfect way to sing the national anthem. And because, they're saying, oh, I know you're going to sing it in 10 different ways in your own way, but there's only one way. But that one way was kind of very heraldic and very 19th century. So, of course, the ironies of state formation. So different projects are manifesting. This is one that I did in Denmark when Denmark was struggling to figure out its relationship to the formation of the Union. And this project was called Stories, and it was done in Copenhagen. And what I kind of wanted to talk about, like notions of first, second, and third world, and who and whether one should sort of these systems. It's kind of weird how these works manifested. My kids were small at the time, and I went to a sports meeting and they were running about, and then there was this podium, and then the kid that wins gets to be first, second, and third. And I started thinking about the Afro-American athletes in the Mexico Olympics in '68, which was pivotal when I was growing up. But I also thought it's about systems of evaluation, and if you put a fence around that system, what do? Do you break down the barricade to get in, or do you simply stay on the outside and embark on a narrative of one's own choosing? And so this project really talked about sort of property and statehood. And so I had these podiums out in the park. But the fun part about the project was that I decided to fence off the benches in the park and that people had to apply, just as the spring was coming, people would have to apply for keys to be able to sit on a park bench, because the benches were fenced off. And of course, it was like a visa form, and it asked spurious questions about them. And then I would randomly decide who I would allow to get keys. If you were successful, I would give you a key, as you can see in this photograph, and the key would declare you an owner man, which goes back to my colonial engraving. And if you were unsuccessful, I would stamp the runaway slave it on your visa application form. So it was talking about borders and migration and so on. But more importantly, it was talking about why would you want to live in an enclosure out in open, fluid space, and what that means. And there were all kinds of questions that came up about this project. I kind of did a version in Haiti, which was really bizarre. And in the museum in Haiti, and but the problems in Haiti were different because, of course, I had to figure out a different way to make people get access to the keys. So in Haiti, it was a gambling trick where I would do that kind of inverted cup with 3 cards, and one card had the runaway slave, and only one card had the owner man. And in Haiti, one or two, I had only a few keys. So eventually, as the project manifested, I gave 1 or 2 people got keys. But what I found was really interesting. While in Denmark, I found people inside the enclosures at night walking around the city. And some of them said, oh, we are anarchists. We broke in anyhow. And then some people actually had keys. Some people would just open it up and leave it open as a kind of act of rebellion. But Haiti was really peculiar. What happened in Haiti, I put garden furniture and fresh croissants, wine, and flowers every day in the enclosure. And people came and opened it and sat and had wine and had croissants and so on. But like in this particular photo, which is really interesting, like this guy would bring his own daughter, sit, give us some wine, have some croissants. And he came with another friend, and the friend had to stay outside because he didn't have a key. So it became a kind of bling and a kind of contention. And it spoke a lot about certain cultural things there that I didn't quite understand. There are many versions. I mean, I'm going to run through. So in a lot of my work, I'm sort of working with things I see and feel around me at home, and then see how they translate into a wider context. This was a weird photograph I became obsessed with, a politician who was a minister of finance at the time. And he was leaving a meeting, a very contentious meeting in the mid-90s. And what happened was, this was a photo in the newspapers, a kind of no comment. He's leaving the meeting and he looked back at the photographers very smugly. And in my mind, I thought about the kind of B movies I grew up watching in the 70s, we looked at B movies from the Philippines. The Philippines had a kind of James Bond. I think he was called Tony Falcon, Agent 44X or something. He had a machine gun with a silencer and a see-through shades. And so, it looked, I kind of thought, man, when you have bread and wheels, you're good to go. So I started designing these bread and wheel things. And to talk about moving capital and, and it turned into a whole project then about how capital moves on the planet. Again, I'm very confused about this project in the sense that, when you think about what's going on in Ukraine at the moment and the food crisis that's pending based on, because this project was called Once You Have Bread and Wheels, You're Good to Go. I meant bread in terms of the 70s construct of money. But these projects were about capital and the movement of capital. I even did some with some tricked out wheels just for the heck of it. I won't spend much time with this. The project about fear, people made it themselves in the triangle in Puerto Rico. Fear as a product in terms of political campaigns in the post 9/11 period. And this brings me here. I kind of got back to drawing, and I started this series called Tropical Night around 2005, between 2005 and 2012. And I was kind of working on images and trying to sort of rinse out certain vocabularies that were in front of me, and trying to get past a certain kind of expectation around 19th century vocabularies in terms of how people understand the Caribbean as a space visually. You're always talking about sugar and plantations, and while these things are foundational, they're really not immediately in front of us. We kind of walk on and countries like Trinidad or Jamaica, even though we talk about agricultural things and the kind of, the different global addictions, the big global addiction a couple of years ago was sugar. In Trinidad, it was oil. In Jamaica, it was bauxite. So it's not always agricultural. It's not always rooted in the kind of plantation sugar story. that's really an 18th century. By the time the 19th century unfolded, most of these things were winding down, but somehow there's a kind of romantic notion about this past. So I kind of wanted to find new vocabularies to talk about where we were. And I was also interested in a kind of fluidity, in the sense that these works, every time they were installed, the configuration of the drawings, even though they were sequential, would change based on topical things. And the drawings covered a number of themes. I always use this one when I talk because it talks about my own experiences in the 70s, and I never realized how this would come back in my work later on. In the 70s, we had, when oil was becoming part of the story of Trinidad in particular, there was a lot of political dissent, and there were a lot of summary executions, a lot of weird shit that happened, as was happening all over Latin America and different parts, the world. And I began, it shaped my sort of developing years. So this piece is a very interesting one. It talks about a certain, well, it's obvious, right? One piece is called See-Through Jersey, See-Through Gun, See-Through Body, Afro-Ophelia, Status Cash Register, and the Venus of Avianca. So a lot of Colombian women were coming into Trinidad as mules, human trafficking scam. Young people died, were found, their bodies were found in the forest, shot up. It was also kind of around the time that I was coming of age. And one of the colonial books, one of the books coming out of colonialism that we read as we entered into English, formal English in the school system, had Beardsley drawings of Ophelia, just 1 second. There's a radio that came on. Sorry, I don't know if you all are hearing it. I'm sorry, but one of my kids just started turned up a radio very loud. So this series, I won't get into it, but it basically, I'd traveled to Spain. I'd looked at Goya's drawings, and I started from here, about sort of like, the Saturnalia that was going on in the era in which I grew up. And the Nelson Reader, which was a book that ushered us into English. So that's the grapes of knowledge. If you grew up in the Caribbean in a certain time, you would recognize, in the Anglophone Caribbean, you would recognize this symbol, because it was sort of like the standard textbook that everybody learned English, grammar, the Afrophilia. We had so that was a series. And in the body of work, there were many speculations. Like this one, I always liked, like how tall a wall has to be for you. This is an image of coming from my memories of being a child and swimming in the sea and sitting in the water and watching the horizon and watching the ocean. But at the same time, it also talks about boundaries, whether in the ocean is infinite or whether the ocean represents the thing that encloses the island space. Of course, as my thinking has evolved, the ocean becomes infinite, more so than a border. And but then at this time, I thought about the wall, how tall a wall has to be for you to just see over it, but it's too tall for you to leap over it with one single bound. So there were lots of speculations about architecture, space, the ocean, and so on. And I won't get into these, but these were all part of the same series. This one is like, it's like a Creole dog that pees in four corners of the paper to declare territory. And this is a piece from the same series that I suppose is one of the most reproduced works of mine that like I don't know what to do about this work, because even though I'm glad that it gets the traction it has gotten, but it's one drawing of a series of 400. So I'm always a little overwhelmed about how sort of institutional practice and publishing practices can kind of narrow one's production. And so I'm the guy that does this thing, but there's a whole 400 other drawings in the series in which a number of other reflections have manifested that haven't come to the table. That was one of the installations at the Brooklyn Museum. This is another one at the Tate Liverpool. It's called, so back to my office equipment, thinking about different kinds of globalism, people on the move, traveling with their skills and their imaginations. This little bench is a very typical bench that you find in any home in the Caribbean, I grew up in, that people use, to do simple tasks in the garden, in the kitchen, in the house, or whatever, or on the side of the road. And I started to think about it in terms of the other globalization of brown and black bodies moving around the planet, going to, to Western Union to send money home, and circulatory patterns. And this evolved into a project in which I collaborated with designers and built these installations that talk about these meandering patterns. One of the things that's fascinating about this, just using a simple office equipment to make this kind of sculptural installation, is that I've done it in a number of different countries. But even if I do it in Johannesburg or Lexington, Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky, or Baltimore, or Johannesburg, or I don't know where the material is from, because the paper that I bought in Johannesburg to do these rubber stamps could have been made in India. And when I used the paper in Trinidad, it could have come from China or, or from Brazil. So there's a kind of weird thing about me moving, making this work, and the materials having, coming from different locations. And that was starting to occur to me more and more as the work manifested itself in different locations around the world. Different versions, right? So I'm going to run through this stuff. I started experimenting with different things. The Made in China thing is kind of interesting. I discovered a couple of years ago, I started noticing Made in China stamps in cheap stores around the city, because I walk around the city a lot, Port of Spain, and I've discovered that they're there because of suitcase traders, because we are one of those countries that had a very early tax and import trade relation to China. So what people would do is they would go to the free zones in Aruba and Margarita, and they would buy clothes, and then in the hotel they would rip off all the labels, and then they would put made in China stamps on the boxes and come into Trinidad and not pay taxes. These are like street level suitcase traders. And that kind of became fascinating to me, to the point that I made a Made in China box to talk about, sort of like the political class in the Caribbean, in the new sort of Belt and Road relationship, whereby it becomes a thing for them to stand on, but it also looks like the executioner's kind of box that they kick out from under them. The politician could stand on his soapbox that's made in China, but what about the dangers of this new? Well, I'm not passing any judgment, but we are obviously not in the same kind of IMF or colonial relationships we had before when we enter into these negotiations with China. So I was kind of tossing this reflection out. And I did an installation where I invited different people to come and stand on the box and photograph themselves. They had to be well dressed, and and people came in a performance. So I won't spend much time here. I want to kind of close off this conversation. I found myself back in drawings. I never thought I would return to drawings so fastidiously. And I did an installation at the Betsy Hotel in Miami that in which I started to think more and more about oil. And because I am the generation in Trinidad that grew up in what we call the oil boom. In the mid-70s, Trinidad did not sign up to OPEC. So of course, our fortunes were shaped by that. But even though oil provided income and a certain development thrust, with it came a certain kind of one-dimensional social space and a kind of violence, because one often associates violence with poverty, but that's not really true. Violence comes from something else, a kind of consumer reality, a kind of a different relationship to accessing capital and consumerism. Of course, Trinidad was an oil economy, and we were also a place for cocaine transshipment from Colombia. So the kind of violence just really escalated in that sort of period, and I wanted to reflect on that. So this is like drips of blood on terrazzo, a kind of post-utopianism that I was dealing with. This piece was called The Arrest. Of course, at the time, this was done like around 2012, 2013, the early phases that led towards the Black Lives Matter issue. And but I was thinking a lot about soca as popular music. Soca always wants you to put your hand up in the air. And I kind of thought about, this kind of irony in terms of the increasing violence and the kind of hedonism that the society was going through at the time. And of course, the oil pumps. What I didn't know, I also started drawing these strange insect-like creatures. And what I didn't know at the time, this is more of the sound work. I won't spend much time there. So to kind of get to the end of my presentation, I did around 2014, I did a residency at Northwestern in Chicago. And I was taking walks along Lake Michigan. And I suddenly decided I wanted gasoline pumps, gas station pumps and hoses. Because I was thinking a lot about violence and mono economies and so on. And of course, I grew up, the generation before me grew up watching cowboy movies, Clint Eastwood, that kind of macho spaghetti westerns, and then conventional cowboy movies. But that I'm a little too young for that. I grew up in, 60s, 70s, right? The cowboy movies were phasing out by the early 70s. So when I was a teenager, what I grew up on was Kung Fu movies, right? Carter Wong, Alexander Fusheng. And one of the things that struck me about those movies is when they started, the opening scene, you would see the Golden Harvest crest, you would see the ocean, and then it would move to different protagonists doing katas and, and all kinds of weird stuff. And of course, I grew up in a time when the cinemas were rowdy and people would jump out of their seats and perform. And so I found myself going a little wacky in Chicago, and I bought these gas pumps and started swinging them around in the studio at night. So that's me swinging it around in the studio at night, thinking about the opening scenes of these Golden Harvest, Run Shaw movies, and about masculine contention for resources on the surface of the planet. This led me to taking drawings and rubber stamps. And then I kind of took two office workers, two people working in the office of the residency, out onto Lake Michigan, and got them to give them the gas pumps and told them, well, and then they acted out all these cowboy movie and kind of weird cowboy things. And that turned into a kind of video installation called The Gas Men, talking about male contention and corporations and territory. But what was weird about this whole enterprise is that the geography of it, because I shot the video in Lake Michigan, I had to go home for a short while to Trinidad, I then developed a soundtrack for it with local musicians. My daughter never saw Chicago. She was in film school. So I flew her to Chicago and she did the final video. These are stills that I shot with just a cell phone while the video shoot was going on. Not sure. And then I got invited by a gallery in Chicago to do a version of the installation out in Gary, Indiana, in an abandoned supermarket where, out in that part of Indiana, there was a kind of oil, like different oil spills and steel plants and weird stuff. So I realized I was kind of entering into a discourse. This is a version of the installation at the Broad Museum in Michigan, at MSU in Michigan. And yeah, and I was realizing that I'm doing these drawings, I'm doing these actions, and a sense of place, like it's like I'm starting to question, am I moving around in this economy? And reflect, so certain questions come up that we can discuss. And then a series of drawings, I returned to drawings. These drawings were made of text where I kind of, the text is improvisational. It's a little bit like a kind of Dostoevsky, kind of notes from underground. It's improvised text, but it's saying libelous things. But the way the text manifests itself on the paper, even though it's logical sentences and things I'm talking about, they kind of blend together where they become difficult to decipher. So the minute in which they appear, they disappear, the thoughts disappear. And of course, it talks about things that I am experiencing at the time, silicone bit heads, gasoline pumps. The lady's shoes refers to a politician at home that had been shot. She, young people being shot, excavators, and these things, and then of course the diagram from the Galvani experiment with the frog, when you connect the electrodes to them, the legs still twitch. But it's talking about sort of these things that happen in the social world that are kind of scary, but like you doubt yourself when you see them. And if you grow up in the tropical space, you get, at least in the context of Trinidad, there's centipedes, there's scorpions, there are things that sometimes by the time you see them, they're slithering out of sight and you're doubting yourself, did I just see that? Or does it bite? What does it do? And so a lot of these things didn't have heads. They seem to be leaving the frame as they, So I was kind of doing these drawings and experimenting there for a while. So these are just different variations of the drawings. Playing around with text, rubbing charcoal, and then combining it with older works, lightbox installation at the Betsy. This one was called Dark Circles. This one really freaks me out because it looks, this was done like around 2015, but it almost looks like COVID diagrams, At the time I was thinking, this installation, I used the soundtrack from Parliament, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, because I was thinking about, the increased death rate, murder rate of young people, its relationship to oil economies and its relationship to, contention of the space for resources on the planet. So there's like crushed flowers. Special delivery was like something weird happened in Trinidad where suddenly we ran out of hearses. So people started converting pickups into hearses to deliver the bodies of the people that were shot. And it kind of reminded me of like the 70s when we had the oil economy, because a lot of young people made money by buying pickup trucks to offload imported goods from the port. So so my mind was really going into different places. So these are like drawings and speculations in this moment and different variations. And now to close off the presentation, I did a residency in 2017, Rauschenberg residency in Captiva Island, in which the conversation fundamentally looked at rising water levels. And I started thinking about these suspended objects, and a young thinker that was part of the discussion started saying that how, with all our ideological differences and around the planet and so on, as the water levels rise, it would both destroy and create new social relations, because we would then be all find ourselves with similar predicaments. So I kind of designed this work called New Level Heads, and it was a suspended work in which heads were swinging to talk about people floating across, brown and black bodies afloat. And there's even an installation that I kind of worked out. You'll get a little sense of it. It's a kind of kinetic look. And then I had this weird encounter where I kind of went to the beach one day and saw some guy a craftsman was making these things to sell on the beach. And I was sitting there, and they were all floating around. There was a head of Shay, a Buddha, an eagle, and a lot of thoughts about, he was just hustling, to sell these things for any kind of hipster that appeared on the beach. But it seemed to be a really kind of weird commentary about sort of the beach, the Caribbean space, a place where ships landed and laid siege to the place, a place where people launch ritual ships, a place where people go just to get a tan, or to fish or work, So I kind of was trying to make sense of that. And the two closing projects are this project, which I never expected it to go this far, but I got invited to do a project with Kenny Bailey in design for social intervention in Boston. And it was a project about gentrification, like how to address issues of gentrification and to kind of investigate social practice. Kenny didn't feel that, I had to stop being an artist and open a soup kitchen. He wasn't advocating that. He was saying that I should stick to my skill set and work with people in the community and see what could create conversation or social relations and so on. So it was a very intimidating project, because almost everything I proposed was rejected by the community or by organizers. And then one day, out of absolute desperation, I took some bits of cardboard and built this step. And this step spoke about shuttle housing in the Caribbean. After a storm, or if you go to certain abandoned plantations, or if you go to parts of the cities like Port of Spain, where there was kind of barrack and shuttle housing, you would find simple steps like this. They're often painted red or green sometimes. And I just plunked one down on an empty lot. This is just made out of paper, cardboard. And then people started showing up and saying, why is this here? Because it reminded them of the place they left, but the place to which they could never return, home. For various reasons, if they're from Ghana, Cape Verde, Haiti, or whatever. And so it kind of, I realized that something was going on. So I designed a project where you could make this step anywhere. And then I got invited to do the step in Bogota, where I moved it through the street. This is a version of it in Kingston, in Jamaica, another version of it in Boston. A young rapper even made a video with it. I didn't even know. I left it in the space I run in Port of Spain called Alicia, and some guy went and made a video. And then I did a new version just recently, because even though I thought this would die like since 2017, I got invited to do it in a show in Berlin last year, where each version of the project, I do it collaboratively with an artist. And this project, I decided to work with a young Chinese artist living in Berlin. And he wanted to photograph this step, for example, in a square in Berlin, that is dedicated by the Germans to an invasion of China back in the late 19th century. And so it was kind of interesting as a result of this invasion. That's why there's Tsingtao Bear, because Tsingtao Bear was done by the Germans, as they kind of moving in. And I found it was interesting to have a family in the park having a Sunday picnic, like something from an old Weimar Republic movie, next to the step, which talks about the labor in dark other places that creates this kind of wonderful privilege to have this kind of life, because this square is dedicated to an incursion into China by Germans, back in the 19th century. So the project just kept shifting, and there are other projects talking about architecture and space, and I'm speculating. But the closing project, this is I feel like maybe I should stop here because I want to bring you all in. I don't want to keep you up for too long. This is my project in the Sharjah Biennial, where I decided to build a scaffolding out in the desert, which seems like a futile gesture, to impose a kind of gridded space on the kind of natural environment. And for the video, I tried to build it and take it down in one day. But what happened when I was doing it, like Bedouin kids kind of like photobomb the thing. So when I got back home, I realized that there was a tension between the kind of workers that go to these countries from everywhere to do the work and the people that live there. These kids were extremely aggressive and defiant. When one of the people that went there with me said, please, this is a video for the Sharjah Biennial, supported by, the sheik and this kind of thing. And the kids like, we don't care about that. What the fuck you doing here? We here, this is our space. We out on the desert playing, why are you bothering us? So there was a kind of interesting tension that I was fascinated by. And so the project changed, and I used all the off footage of the Turan photobombing rather than focus on my original concept. And the piece was called, Elsewhere's, Elsewhere's or end or beginnings and endings, and then the most recent project was a series of drawings that started in Sharjah when I visited doing my sort of doing my site visits for the Sharjah Biennial in 2018. I was kind of freaked out by the environment. I come from the Caribbean, and the Southern Caribbean, which is very kind of tropical and Amazonian and wet. To find oneself in a kind of desert space, but of course, to also look at the kind of the spectacle of development in these sort of countries like Dubai and Abu Dhabi. And it really freaked me out. And I started doing these little drawings, and I didn't really know where it would go. The drawings, and this piece called Turbulence, which is a kind of kinetic work. It actually moves, it's consisting of drawings, and it's talking about sort of penetrating the surface, back to the silicone bit heads that drill on the ground. And a friend of mine gave me a 9mm bullet, and I kind of held the 9mm bullet in my hand and thought about the feel of it, about things penetrating the surface to release liquids like blood or oil. And so the drawing series was called Turbulence. This is the version that was in the Liverpool Biennial. And then I did another version that's up right now in Stavanger in Norway. And it's a series of text sketches, and it has a sequential thing. But what is interesting me is that the drawings can be seen from both sides. It sort of floats in the space. And a work like this can be anywhere. It's not dependent on the white box exclusively, even though it looks lovely there. And it's a kind of work that you have to look at it hovers between concepts of drawing, sculpture, and also the kind of ephemerality of suspended form, and that I'm investigating. I'm nowhere resolved in this question, but I thought I would end my presentation here and kind of showing the narrative of how my work has developed around the concepts that I've been discussing over the last couple of days. And I'm going to stop to let you guys in. So let me just, so the ball is in your court. Huh?
Thank you so much. That was so wonderful. You've given us so much to think with. I want to open the floor for questions.
Way over time there, sorry.
That's okay. I want to open the floor for questions, and we have, I can allow people to speak since many are attendees from also our seminars.
Mm-hmm.
Jean says, I enjoy how you make use of materials.
Actually, that's an interesting question. I mean, because like when I, both in the Liverpool Biennial, when the conservators and the curators were talking to me, I had a really weird conversation with one of the exhibition designers. He said, I really like your footprint. And I said to him, because I mean, this work, the drawings are from a sketch pad that I was drawing at my home here in Port of Spain in my studio. And then I sent instructions on how to build those suspended structures, which are made of string, lumber that you can buy in hardware stores, and kebab sticks, and just simple bulldog clips to suspend the drawings. Of course, you know, in the earlier part of the conversation, I spoke about carnival production when I was a child, you know, teenager, you know, to use very, very simple available materials to occupy space efficiently, you know, to convey an idea. But at the same time, I'm also talking about, apart from the fact that my first studio was in my parents' office, annoying the workers in the office, you know, playing around with all the rubber stamps and the things on my parents' desk. You know, the arsenal of bureaucracy, so to speak. I think also it came from economic necessity. You know, I still don't, I don't have a gallery, you know, you know, and when you're dealing with the kind of tool of fairs and biennials, the big question is, you know, what kind of visa do you have, you know, in your wallet or in your passport? You know, how do you move around? How do you function in these economies? And I'm not on it. I'm not in that economy. So my practice, some of these works are produced just with very, very simple, manageable materials. Mm-hmm. So one of the conservators said to me, you know, I kind of worked in Notting Hill, helping as a student produce, and I kind of noticed the same attention to materiality and so on. So I was very intrigued by that, because you know, sometimes you take things for granted. I didn't realize, I didn't put that kind of connection to my interest in materials. So the footprint, you know, the curator was astonished. They just got a box with drawings, and then they could just assemble it based on instructions. And I was doing that in the past out of just sheer desperate necessity to stay in the game. You know? But now I kind of think, wait, it's something, you know, it's something to think about in another way.
And I think it's there too, when you were talking about oil in Trinidad in the 70s too, the way that oil comes in the kind of material that you're using, and how you represent the kind of technology of oil, as well as how it's connected to the history of what's going on there. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing about oil is that you know, it's really strange. I mean, in our dialogues over the last 3 days, you know, we talked a little bit about institutional. There's a kind of way in places like the Caribbean, like, I don't know what causes this, right? You know, maybe, when I was in art school and doing sort of early things about art history, there was this kind of old-fashioned wisdom that something can't enter into the canon unless it's at least 50 years old, right? Like, because then you need research and, to kind of make it credible for kind of research and that kind of thing, right? Of course, as the contemporary discussions and the internet and all kind of, everything is sped up, right? So that kind of conventional wisdom or sort of empirical kind of response to kind of research data and material culture has really changed. So there's a kind of way in which maybe, but academia, it doesn't, I'm not deflating or saying it's not interesting, but there's a kind of peculiar way, a kind of peculiar demand that we kind of stay in the 19th century when we talk about the Caribbean. Even though, these things are foundational, as I said, they kind of, I mean, in the context of Trinidad was a place, one of the first places on the planet where oil was dragged out of the ground, in the late 19th century. Sugar had already become irrelevant by the middle of the 19th century. And in fact, Trinidad was more important for cocoa in the early 20th. There was a time when the Trinitario was a hybridized brand of cocoa that is still used now for certain very expensive European chocolates. But a kind of disease wiped out the crop in the late 30s. And then there's a big resurgence now. There are a lot of young people investigating and planting cocoa again as the prices of oil have shifted, right? But then, so there's a kind of way in which and the shift in terms of, I mean, in my own practice, I think the Caribbean was a very violent and dangerous place to be and move around in the 18th century because sugar was the big addiction. Where in the world is very dangerous to move around right now because of current addictions? The new addictions are oil. There was a kind of middle period with cocaine, right? But the violence, and and I think, so there's a kind of way in which we have to rethink something about how institutions respond and react to the Caribbean.
Does anyone have any questions? Oh, you have a hand. Juana, I'm going to allow you to talk here. Here we go.
It's hard. I can't quite formulate the question yet. It was a lot of information, and so my wheels are sort of not moving quite that fast yet. Yeah. But first, looking at the work, I was trying to see by the nature of how to categorize the work, and is the work, would I consider the work that of a sort of nomadic, right? That is something that moves around, but at the same time, I didn't quite feel that it fitted that category either, that somehow this means of production in which you engage with the work. I'm trying to think about, it's taking me a little time to put it together. Like it has enough of a sense of, I would say, like place, maybe, even if we're talking about space in terms of the Caribbean, that when it leaves and it takes root somewhere else, it still holds onto a certain dynamic of what it is, right? But it also transforms itself. And so I haven't quite grasped the totality of it, or I'm interested to consider about whether, and this term feels 19th century, or maybe 20th century, where if you feel that the making of this work has become global in its dynamic, or do you still feel it centers itself somehow around the Caribbean? Or does it even really matter at all anymore? How would you describe this work?
Well, it really has to do with what one's sense of the Caribbean is. I think in our conversations over the last 3 days, we talked about the Caribbean more as a space than a place. It's a place in terms of it being a colony, being a plantation, a nation state, but it's a space in terms of a critique, a kind of way of negotiating and understanding the world. And I think with what I think about is that in the Caribbean, we ourselves, regardless of which language group we come from, I think the real issue is to kind of how do we see ourselves, because globalism began in the Caribbean. It's not that the Caribbean has to become global. The Caribbean comes into existence in the industrial age with transplanted people as external labor camps of Europe. And then when Europe gone, we then had to turn around and say to ourselves, why are we here? And how do we make these places, which were never meant to be places in that sense of home and belonging, into spaces that can produce something meaningful beyond the expediency. You know, I mean, it's a very difficult challenge that's placed on the Caribbean subject, that people just take for granted, because you know, the question is, why are we here? We know we were brought here to work and to, you know, build Versailles and England and different parts of the world through our labor. And then suddenly people turn around and tell us we must just stay on these little rocks and do what? You know, if I mean, I'm just saying these things provocatively, right? But we know that Caribbean people are on the move. They're moving all the time, you know. And I mean, just think of it. I mean, I was just looking at the news a minute ago, and people are trying to enter England, and now they're telling them they're going to send them to Rwanda, and then the leader of a country is saying, well, that's a potential punishment. And then maybe the people in Rwanda are going to make money by taking these people. But it's not the first time that people in Europe have done dastardly things like this. I mean, I think I saw a documentary recently about Polish people that were sent to Iran. And then during the Second World War, and then Iran it wasn't working out. And then they sent them, like Polish Jews and other people, they dumped them somewhere in Kenya. You know, it's crazy. You know, it's almost like a kind of large scale rendition of some kind, you know, and it's, I don't know what's going on. You know, we're living a really crazy time. I mean, this is so, so vile, you know, this concept of punishing people for just being on the move, you know, and why are they moving? Because this is the world that was created, you know, these fortresses that they've created. It's kind of sad, I think, you know. I mean, I'm still in shock. I just saw it on the news a minute ago, so sorry, I'm a bit incoherent, but I just couldn't believe this was going on, you know. So I think, yeah, it's a very interesting question, you know, but I think the Caribbean is the beginning of a lot of this crap. We are like the rehearsal space. But now that they're gone, we are the people that come up as a consequence of these enterprises and expeditions now have to think very deeply about the value of our very being. Not just in each island, but how we move and how we impact on other societies everywhere. So, I mean, I don't think, because the Caribbean came into being at that kind of juncture of what constitutes globalization, international trade, treaties, borders, the movement of people, goods, and materials. You know, that's what we're about. I mean, I'm talking about in the era post-Columbus. You know, before that, the indigenous populations were going about their business, and their business or their processes were interrupted, by Columbus and by subsequent other, you know, invaders and marauders, which brings us to where we are now. Somebody has a long question there. But that's you, Anna.
I have one more question, and so this is in relationship,
Yeah,
because
I'm just reading a text that somebody sent. I wasn't sure. Okay, go ahead.
Go ahead. So the two pieces, the one, two, three steps, which I found really interesting,
Yeah.
because it sort of kind of determines your value also in a way. And then the red steps, in which you have to climb up, and you're actually, for me, it also feels like you're being elevated, right? You have the ability to transcend. You're no longer on the lower ranks, right? So they're both working in that way. But I'm more interested, if you consider the red steps when you're working collaborative with another artist, uh, is the process one of translation, right, in which they're taking your idea and translating, or do you think it's a process of interpretation or reinterpretation? Are they sort of taking your work, and by putting it in the park, are they reinterpreting the work, or does the nature of the work continues the same? And I mean, it seems that for you, it doesn't matter, that you welcome those moments of interruption, and that's what I see them, interruption and almost transformation in a way, right? Like you have an idea, and this idea ended at a move to towards direction, and then someone intercedes it, and that intersection shifts the direction in which the work goes, and it may hold some aspect of where it began, but it might also not. And so I'm curious to think
It's
about how
kind of like an
you sort of
adventure.
think about the word.
It kind of goes back to what we were talking about, risk and things not being predictable and being controlled. But it also kind of hovers around questions of authorship, and defying that, which in my mind, singular authorship. And in my own mind, it starts to move towards this concept of fluidity, because I think there's a kind of demand, just as there's a demand for originality and a demand for sole authorship, but these seem to be market conditions, not so much about, these don't seem to be conditionalities related to sort of discursive, dialogical kind of developments of a practice, so that's kind of why with the red steps, it didn't start that way. It started with me in dialogue with Kenny Bailey of Design for Social Intervention, and this young couple, well, younger than me, I kind of old, Intelligent Mischief in New York, Aisha Shillingford and her part, because they have a kind of they're interested in speculative fiction and Black futures, and I found myself in Chicago listening to Kenny and listening to them, and we kind of devised this, and then I kind of went off and did versions in Croatia and Colombia. In fact, I'm due to do a new version I'm now negotiating a version that will be in Turkey, hopefully in Istanbul and Munich, and a version in Nashville, Tennessee, which kind of freaks me out. And in each iteration, I'll be working with another artist. And I'm kind of fascinated how this kind of strange object can sort of become a sign, or not a sign, or like I don't know, a symbol that kind of moves across a geographic and cultural, so I don't really have answers, because this is it's something that's been evolving in my own practice, and I'm trying to understand it, but I'm extremely intrigued by it. It feels mischievous, because of course, people, there's lots of messy peripheries, in terms of how it can be read and how it can develop, that I don't really have the answers for right now. And it does counter something about the training and the indoctrination that I came through going to conventional art school, adjacent to kind of market and all these kinds of things, Okay, that long text there was yours, Juana, or is that somebody else in the message board?
No, that was from Naomi.
I'm trying to read it, yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, different. I mean, this was a couple of years ago, but I think the version, what I learned from the podium piece, the Terror Stories piece, in Denmark, well, two things. One, I was kind of arguing with a kind of Hegelian construction of history, of winners and losers, and and which I was trying to translate that into first world, second world, and third world. I was also trying to talk about who's in the engine of history and who's not, because of course Denmark was trying to figure out their relationship to the forming of the European Union, and I was trying to figure out my relationship to these kinds of art world discussions. And of course, the podium is a symbol of evaluation. Somebody has to be the best, first, second, and third prize. So that has to do with the auction block in slavery. Of course, the popular iconography of the 1968 event in Mexico. So all these things were kind of imploding in my mind. But the version that was in Denmark, when the public there engaged it, they were talking about their rights. Okay, people talked about rights. There was a kind of something was being contested: the right to be in the public space, the right to occupy space, the annoyance of filling out a bureaucracy. When I got to Haiti, I realized that the forms and all those things would have been problematic. So I kind of shifted something about the context of Haiti as another Caribbean territory. The kind of notion of, when I was playing the gambling game with people on the street, everybody was trying to trick me and I was trying to trick them because I had a limited amount of keys. And one of the questions that was asked of me, of one of the persons on the street, was not what their right was, but how can I beat the system and get through by getting a key? So that kind of talked about the dynamic of the respective societies. And I had tremendous empathy with that as a Caribbean person. It was very educational. I mean, I never developed this piece in other contexts. So it kind of ended as it begun, unlike these other projects that have shifted locations over time. So yeah, and something about Haiti made me come up with the gambling option. Like it was in the ether, like in the air. Like it seemed to be the only way to move. While in Denmark, it would not have made any sense. Oh my God, my neighbor's dogs are having fun. Life in the tropics. What's the other? Okay, all right.
Do we have any final questions or comments?
Okay, somebody said thanks. Well, I'm thanking you all for your patience. I went way over the time.
No, it was wonderful. Thank you so much.
So are we done for now?
I guess if there's no more questions, then we can end there. And then we have each other's emails now, so we can continue the conversation in that regard.
Yeah, and I must say, I mean, I thank you all for your patience, and I thank Donna and everyone at the ICA for asking me to do this. But I want to say after a long, like everybody else, after a long sojourn in the COVID headspace, I think this was one of the moments where I found myself slowly climbing out of it. I don't know if I'll get there yet, but a lot of what has mobilized my work over the years has been the degree to which I can have conversations about it. And so I've really appreciated the kind of requirement for me to talk, because I haven't spoken about my work in about 2 or 3 years because of COVID, and two, to have to respond to questions about the work. And that is extremely stimulating, and it really helps a lot. So I'm very thankful, for the kind of for the moment that we've had together, because it has really helped me a lot.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you for sharing all of your work. It was so nice to see all of the different pieces. Yeah, every time I was jotting something down, I love the kids in front of the the sculpture. I mean,
I wish I could have shared the actual videos with you,
yeah.
But I figured just for time, stills and so on. Yeah, because the actual videos bring up another question,
Mhm. Well, thank you so much. Say good night to everyone, and we'll see you at the next Art and Research Center event. Hopefully in person.
Everyone. Good night. Goodbye.
Good night.